Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Policy, talking about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the newest album from Tarja called The Shadow Self. But first off, some unfinished business. When I covered Tarja's last album, Colors in the Dark, way back in 2013 when I was first starting up this channel, I'm fairly certain I mangled the pronunciation of her name several times over, so I like to start off by apologizing for that. I didn't mean to. But truth be told, that's probably the most I actually remember about that review, or most of that album if I'm being brutally honest. I know, it's been 3 years, but I haven't really been inclined to go back to Tarja's solo work, even compared to what she did with Nightwish, and I'm not sure why that is. Going back to Colors in the Dark, it's a damn good album, but with the exception of a few songs, it never really grabbed me in comparison with the symphonic metal that I truly loved. I probably overrated it a little bit back in 2013. Maybe it was the buzzy industrial effects that never really clicked for me, or the songwriting that never really came together as a thematic whole, but Colors in the Dark very quickly fell into the category of being an album that I really liked, but not one I felt inclined to really revisit. A very good record, but probably not a great one. Well, it became very clear that Tarja wasn't slowing down the slightest, even in the lead up to this release, dropping an EP back in April called The Brightest Void, with songs that had to be cut from this album. It was practically a record in its own right, produced by Tarja herself and featuring the sort of eclectic elements that she had never touched before, from the horns and harmonica that dominated Your Heaven and Your Hell, to the creaking, piano-driven, glitchy atmospherics on An Empty Dream and Witch Hunt. And that's not counting the Paul McCartney deep cut House of Wax, or the symphonic metal cover of Goldfinger that really completely missed the point and isn't nearly as good as you'd otherwise hope. But okay, whatever, that's an EP of extras. Now we've got the full album, The Shadow Self. How is it? Well, okay. If you were expecting Tarja to slow things down on her full-length album, yeah, that didn't happen, as this is easily her heaviest and most aggressive solo album of her career, to say nothing of her weirdest, with some twists that I don't even think her die-hard fans will see coming. And yet, it really works for me, better than I think the majority of people will give her credit. Colors in the Dark may have been the first definitive stake that Tarja was capable of holding her own as a solo artist, but The Shadow Self shows the sort of thematic cohesion and willingness to experiment and push her sound and themes that makes her a tremendous force to be reckoned with entirely on her own merits, cause yeah, this is a great record. Now the first thing to note is that there's a little bit of overlap between this album and The Brightest Void. Both Eagle Eye and No Bitter End appear on both albums, albeit with superior mixes here, and the former featuring Red Hot Chili Peppers drummer Chad Smith contributing a solid, if unexceptional, drumline. And like with their previous two projects, there's actually a cover song here, in this case being of Muse's Supremacy from The Second Law, that's arguably worth the price of this album itself. Now, I shouldn't be surprised that the song was incredible. The original Supremacy was a really good song, but Tarja's operatic swell doesn't need those filters that Matt Bellamy needed to hit those even higher notes with weight. And she gives the song such a much thicker, roiling groove that's a fantastic fit for her symphonic bombast. And I continue to find myself amazed how much she's grown as a vocalist and a performer. Her vocal range and tone only getting clearer and more expressive, capable of belting like few others even in modern music, and yet also capable of stripping things back to gentler, more ethereal acoustics like on The Living End, so she doesn't overwhelm the underlying compositions. And, of course, the excellently layered symphonic multi-tracking does her a lot of favors. She sounds beautiful on this album. Unfortunately, it also means that her guest singers are placed at even more of a disadvantage than usual. And while I didn't mind Tarja's brother Tony showing up on Eagle Eye, I was a lot less of a fan of arch enemies Alissa White-Gluz's growling vocals on Demons in You. I didn't like it when she showed up on Camelot's Haven, and I'm not exactly wild about her showing up here. Granted, she's less of a detraction of the song than more of a distraction, because there's a lot going on in that track, and indeed on this entire album. These are easily some of Tarja's most layered and complex compositions to date, and considering how many strange directions this album goes, it's kind of astonishing how well they hold together with consistently solid production, all of which came from Tarja herself. I'll give her a lot of props there. And so much of it works because she hits on a very solid formula fairly early on. Anchor your primary melody and the very prominent piano, supplemented with some thicker rhythm guitars and the occasional solo that, yeah, could be given a little bit more room to breathe in the mix, and then ensure that you got stable grooves, a thicker bass, and propulsive drum work that really has some potent crispness to stand out against the symphonic backdrop. And building off of that, while never compromising the melodic motifs and hooks, it lets Tarja get away with a lot of riskier twists. Forget the modern classical touches on Innocence with a pretty large piano solo. What threw me off guard was the funk metal touches on Demons in You. Yeah, they don't really stick around for the entire song, but they do have an off-kilter edge that I'd love to see her explore more. It sounded surprisingly good. Then you throw in the grinding touches on the guitars on No Bitter End that are borderline thrash, the distant bagpipes to the living end, the ghostly trappings of Undertaker that picks up some great grooves in the percussion, and the much rougher alternative metal guitar tones on Calling from the Wild that builds to a monstrous groove. You've got a pretty diverse but ultimately fascinating listen. And then there's the ramshackle nautical carnival of Diva. That's hard not to see as Tarja throwing down the gauntlet to Nightwish that she can match or perhaps even surpass them in their modern state. Now look, I won't say all the production touches really work for me. There's an odd shrillness on the edges and especially on the bridge of Love to Hate that doesn't quite fit in well against the awesome shift to a major key midway through that song, and some of the more buzzing elements on Eagle Eye feel like remnants that could have been left back on Colors in the Dark. But really, those are some minor quibbles. And I should also mention that this album ends with Too Many, which features a hidden track after a few minutes of silence. It's a bit of a jumbled bit of genre experimentation. Honestly, if I'm being clear here, the record doesn't really have the strongest ending. Not quite able to sustain the fantastic momentum that comes in before it. The last two songs, not quite great. Now we gotta talk about lyrics and themes though, and in a sense, some of this is ground that Tarja has examined before. Colors in the Dark was exploring the various shades of moral ambiguity and how it wasn't all plain black and white, and the Shadow Self expands upon it to find it with a little bit more personal touch, looking to examine the darkness within herself that Tarja uses to create her art. You know, it's almost fitting that she got Chad Smith from the Red Hot Chili Peppers, given that those are analogous themes to lead single Dark Necessities, but Tarja expands the idea to go deeper into her past, and what she finds is a much more openly passionate, commanding presence who isn't afraid to indulge her raw ego, with the biggest example, yeah, it's Diva. And yeah, as someone kind of familiar with the drama that happened after Tarja left Nightwish almost 10 years ago, it's hard not to go back through that song and not see it as a message not just to Two of Us, but also a reclamation of the label that she'd been given in a pure moment of dark triumph. It's really a powerful moment. The cover of Supremacy fits much in the same mold, as does the message to move on coming through No Bitter End and Love to Hate. And yet, it's kind of telling how the record ends after so much indulgence and passion and pride on lyrical sentiments that could almost be wistful, as Tarja having not just confronted her own dark passions, wondering then she might have been if she had been able to set aside her own pride, the vice in which she's all too much aware of as both her greatest strength and her greatest weakness. And even though I'm not all that wild about Too Many as a song, I really do love the line about how she wishes she could break her pride for a moment in time, set aside her ego for one last memory she could have had, a moment of real poignancy that definitely lends what could have been seen as an ego trip throughout the course of this album, but gives it some deeper pathos and moral ambiguity, almost a deconstruction if you might say. But in short, while I didn't quite return to Colors in the Dark very often, I can definitely see myself going back to a fair few songs off the Shadow Self a lot more. At this point, Tarja has advanced as a singer, songwriter, producer, and artist as a whole to some pretty impressive heights in symphonic metal, and this is easily her strongest work yet, netting a solid 8 out of 10 from me, and definitely a recommendation if you're a fan of some kick-ass symphonic metal that dreams big and sticks the landing. And at this point, I'd love to see where Tarja's darker passions might take her. If the music is this good, it's gonna be one hell of a journey. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. I'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Got the poll up here, so what do you guys think of this album? Do you think it's actually better than the previous stuff she got before? Do you think she's actually comparable with where Nightwish is right now? Because I gotta be honest, I like the Shadow Self a lot more than I like Endless Forms Most Beautiful. The production's certainly better. Till then, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or any other albums coming out that you want me to take a look at, I'd be glad to give them a listen. Till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.